Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcasts and YouTube videos. I'm always excited with my guests. I always seem to have the great fortune of having really great guests who agree to come on my silly little podcast and commiserate with me. But I am really pleased to introduce to everyone today a man who really needs no introduction, Mr. Mike Aquilina. Most of my viewers and readers and so on are probably very familiar with Mike Aquilina. He is a fixture in the American Catholic Church. His publications, books, articles, speeches, and so on are too numerous for me to list here today. It would take me 20 minutes to go through everything he's done. He did grow up very near to where I live now. He grew up in Kingston, born in Kingston, PA. Went to school in Pittston, PA, and that's just literally like 15 minutes down the road from me here. And I did have the great fortune of meeting Mike in person a year ago now, or whatever it was. We met up in Scranton.
Yeah, a year and a half because it was right
Yeah,
around, I think it was New Year's Eve.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you live near Pittsburgh now, right? Or do you live near Youngstown, Ohio?
It's Pittsburgh. Yeah, I'm just outside Pittsburgh.
Yeah, which isn't far from Youngstown and so forth.
Nope.
So anyway, I really, as I said to Mike before we went on, I don't have a big list of scripted questions for him. I just know that my viewers and listeners would be very interested in hearing what he has to say on a variety of topics. The thing that is, I've read, I haven't read all of your books, but I've read several of them. And the thing that most interests me in your a couple of things. First, you don't have a PhD.
Mhm.
You have a degree from Penn State. I grew up in the Cornhusker State, so we're kind of football rivals there. But what a great school Penn State is! I have my wife's nephew goes there right now, main campus, beautiful place.
And I
But
worked for the football program for 4 years.
oh, did you really? What did you do?
I was an academic tutor for the football program.
What years
And
were that? Was under Joe Paterno, probably,
it
right?
was, it was, it was, it was 82 to 86 that I worked as a tutor. So I worked 3 years of my undergrad and then a year afterward while I was living in town.
Well,
Uh,
that's fantastic.
it
That's
was a
really great.
program, in my opinion, beyond reproach. I was so impressed by the
Yeah.
academics of the football team.
Yeah. And, it reminded me Nebraskans of that era had a great respect for Penn State and Joe Paterno because it was a program. And I know this is way off topic, but it's a program that we thought very similar to the program that Tom Osborne ran at Nebraska, which is
Mm.
a powerful emphasis on academics, doing everything the right way. I don't care about everything that went down in 2011. I think Joe Pa got a raw deal myself. Along with a lot of other, and I'm not a huge Penn State fan, but I am a Paterno fan, and I thought he got a raw deal. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. My point is that you are living, breathing, walking proof that one doesn't need a PhD in theology to do high level work in theology. And I say that as an encouragement to a lot of my viewers and listeners who write in my com box and other things. And I'm always astounded by the level of erudition of many people. And those of us with PhDs tend to get snotty. And so I love it. I absolutely love it when a guy like you comes along and shows us up, all right, and lets us know that great erudition and scholarship and so forth is possible even without a PhD, probably better without a PhD. Anyway, the other thing is I've been very interested in your interest in patristics in particular. So let's begin. Let's begin there. Uh, the what drew you to the church fathers to begin with? Let's start there.
I think I've always had an interest in antiquity. It may be because my parents were so old when I was born that I always felt connected to the distant past. My both my parents were 47 when I made my appearance. I was a surprise baby. I was their seventh and their youngest. Uh, but when I got to school, I was an ardent reader, and I went to Catholic school there in Pittston,
Pittston.
Pennsylvania, and in our fourth grade classroom, I think it was fourth grade. In the back of the room, we had two libraries, a boys' library and a girls' library, and we'd read our way through the libraries during the course of the year. My friends and I, and there were a lot of cowboy books in the boys' library, and there were a lot of war books in the boys' library. I liked all those things, but one book in particular grabbed me by the lapels, shook me, and held on to me for the rest of my life. And I've since learned that the book's, full of bluster, and that the figure it was about was problematic. But it was a book about Heinrich Schliemann and his discovery of Troy, the gold of Troy.
Yeah.
He went
Yeah.
he went in search for Troy, and he found it, right? He had
Yes.
read the Odyssey, read the Iliad, and then he wanted to find Troy, and he found it. So that got me. I wanted to be an archaeologist like Schliemann. This was before Indiana Jones, so we're talking about ancient history. Uh, but this was my goal. My parents would buy me these books with pictures of artifacts about the ancient civilizations and all that stuff. And my mother got me this collection of replicas of ancient coins, and these were the things I wanted to lay hands on. But as I grew older, I found that archaeologists have to do really boring work, and they have to sift through sand for weeks in a tedious way, and sometimes they do that for weeks and don't find anything, right?
Yeah.
So I decided not to do that because it was too much work. But then
Well,
I discovered that you could kind of do it by reading. You can get into books and read about antiquity, and that's kind of what I did, and it's what I'm still doing today. I enjoy exploring, crossing the ocean, and going in search of the gold of Troy and finding it in a volume of John Chrysostom. I still have that sense of adventure that I wanted when I was a little
yeah.
boy.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And then that just led you to keep on reading other things that led you then to the church fathers.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In high school, we had to learn Latin. I'll always be grateful for that. So I went in pretty well equipped for it. But uh, you know, I've always had this kind of attention deficit. I've never been diagnosed, but I hate being in a classroom, and that's why I did not last more than a semester in graduate school. My grades were perfect. I just couldn't stand sitting in a classroom. I couldn't stand being there. But if I'm working, I love it. If I'm in my office, I love it. So I don't think of myself as a scholar. I'm certainly not an academic. Um, I tend to write the books that I need to read. I'll go looking for a book on a certain topic and it doesn't exist. So I'll try to write that book, and I'll try to write it for people like me, a popular audience, non-academic audience, and I'll try to write it in a way that connects with them. I've never really lived or worked in the academic milieu, and I have no desire to.
I consider that to be a great plus, by the way. I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, my viewers know I retired from the professorate in 2013 to start a Catholic worker farm. And a lot of it had to do with the fact I just couldn't stand it anymore. I
Mhm.
couldn't stand the pretentiousness of the academic world. And I was like you. I felt like, well, I'm writing all these scholarly articles and whatnot. And I just wanted to start reading whatever I wanted to read and writing whatever I wanted to write. And for people that were like me that just sort of wanted a non-scholarly but still erudite. And that's the thing about your writings, Michael. I mean, they may not be scholarly like a Cyril O'Regan or somebody like that, but they're definitely erudite and they're definitely academic in a way. And I think that's their great why they're so popular, why there's a great draw. There's substance there, there's depth there. And I've learned, I've actually, here I am, PhD and all that crap, but oh, sorry. But, I've learned so much from reading your books. So what I want to get into then next is, okay, what, what can we learn in a sense about Catholicism versus, and I don't want to make this into apologetics thing or, a defensive thing, but Catholicism versus a more Protestant reading of church history. What do the church fathers, in a sense, teach us about that sort of divide between the Protestant and Catholic views of church history?
Boy, I'm not an apologist. I don't really do that. It happens kind of naturally in the course of my work, because in my opinion there is such a striking difference between what the fathers show us about the church and the way that church is done in in Protestant denominations, and in non-denominational churches even more so. Uh, yeah, it almost seems to me that to accept the Reformation, you have to believe that the arrival of Martin Luther and John Calvin was an event on the order of the incarnation. That's how radically it changed the thought, the culture, the practice of being Christian.
Yeah.
Suddenly, there was a new way of being Christian that had never existed before. And this is something I've noticed in Protestant historians. They have to find that line that was crossed by the church, when everything changed, and suddenly everything that had been Protestant in style before that time suddenly became Catholic. Okay, and usually the dividing line they propose is the arrival of Constantine. The legalization of Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's when everything went commercial. and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that doesn't work because the year before Constantine, or even go back to when Constantine was in diapers, and you look at the texts from that time, look at the archaeology from that time, and it all looks Catholic. Now, smart historians say, well, no, it wasn't then, and they'll push it back further, and some of them will push it back to the time of Marcus Aurelius, right? Because that's the time when we see that there was a Christian regiment in the army. So there's the example of everything going commercial and everything going bad. But you go back to the time when Marcus Aurelius was in diapers, okay, and go back to the writings of Saint Ignatius of Antioch in 107, and you see that the church was utterly Catholic. You read Clement of Rome in 67 AD, and you're reading about your own parish. You're reading about the Catholic Church, the Church Catholic, the relations between Rome and the distant churches, and that's while the apostles are still alive, some of them at least. So I look into the fathers, and I see the Catholic Church. It's that simple. And I don't think you can argue it. Michael Green, the Anglican evangelical historian, said that he believed that the church went wrong in the generation that took down the words of the apostles. It was the copyists of the New Testament books themselves who went
Yeah.
in the wrong direction with the church. I mean, and to me, that's crazy that God would leave his children orphan for
Yeah.
1,500 years.
Yeah. And so, yeah, the word I like to use is, they're looking, you called it, they're looking for that line of demarcation. They're looking for a rupture.
Yeah.
Where did the rupture happen where true Christianity, which is Protestant in its tonalities, true Christianity morphed into this distortion that became Catholicism. And eventually, when you start peeling back the layers of that onion, I'm glad you brought up Michael Green, because yeah, eventually you have to locate the rupture within the era of the apostles themselves, within the time that the scriptures themselves were kind of being written, because you see a sort of nascent Catholicism already at work in the Pauline pastoral epistles,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And why, for example, in the Acts of the Apostles, did the apostles want to replace Judas? Why not just stay with 11?
Yeah.
Okay, we had 12, now there's 11, so what? Big deal. But that number had symbolic value, right? And they wanted somebody else in a sense in that 12, in the 12ness of it. Uh,
Yes.
so you see, I'm reminded, and then I'll turn it back to you. There was an art, speaking of archaeology, there was an art about 20 years ago. It's very vague in my brain now, but I remember it distinctly. There was an archaeological discovery in Syria of one of the oldest Christian churches that they had, or worship centers that they had ever found. I believe it was dated to mid second to early second century, and it had an altar. All right, it,
Mm-hmm.
it it looked like they had a sort of Catholic altar there. I remember Pat Robertson, the late Pat Robertson, on the 700 Club talking about this. And he said, yeah, well, we have an altar too down in our chapel here at the 700 Club. And, twice a year we do our Eucharist ceremonies on it. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought, wow, what a stretch.
Yeah.
What a stretch, to
Yeah.
say, yeah, we're just like that. our Pentecostal version of Christianity is just like what they found in Syria, which is,
Even
of
though we
course,
won't call it a sacrifice, it's still an
no.
altar. No, it's a total disconnect with the meaning of the words, not only in antiquity generally, but in biblical religion specifically. An altar was a place of sacrifice. That's what the word altar means in Greek, place of sacrifice. So there needs to be a sacrifice on that altar, and I don't know of any Protestants who believe that their Eucharist is um, is a is a sacrifice apart from some Anglicans, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah, probably. Uh, so that you brought up Saint Ignatius of Antioch along these same lines, and of course we have his letters that he wrote, and not only does he gives witness, I think, to two important things along these lines. First, the role of the bishop is front and center, and it's a kind of monarchical concept of the bishop. Where the
Yeah.
bishop is, there is the church. And then the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Okay, and what would you say is the date of like 110 A.D.?
I'd go a little bit early. I'd say I go for 107 AD, but in any event, we're talking about very early. We're talking about a man, an old man, whose life overlapped very much with the lives of the apostles, who, according to tradition, and it's very likely true, he knew the apostles Peter and John, and maybe others as well. So yeah, Ignatius is someone who is very much living in the thought world of the apostles, and we read him, and he may not have had possession of all of the books that we call the New Testament. That's how fresh this is. The books
Yeah,
had not circulated that widely, but what he has, it's clear that he loves with an ardent love, and he knew Jesus so well, even though he had never met him in the flesh, so to speak.
yeah,
He knew Jesus so well that he was with him. He wanted to be with him. He wanted to be closer to him, and he wanted to die for Jesus in the way that Jesus died. So he's this very attractive character because he's so warm, and he never makes arguments for things. And every now and then, he'll cast an anathema at the heresies of that time, because there were already heresies threatening the church. There was Docetism, and he goes after that with both guns blazing, and that there were the Judaizers, and he's going after both of these groups at that time. But for the most part, his letters are just positive letters of spiritual counsel and encouragement to the churches. And there are 7 letters, 6 to churches, 1 to a bishop, and he's writing in this way, and he doesn't give arguments for anything. He just recognizes what's always been there. And he recognizes, as you
right.
said, that those 3 levels of the hierarchy, bishop, presbyter, and deacon, and it's what we know today. He recognizes a church that's focused on Jesus Christ, who's true God and true man. He makes that very clear, both of those points in the course of his letters. And he knows that the Eucharist is the flesh and blood, as he puts it in one place. I love the phrase, it's the blood of God. It's the blood of God. God's blood is what we receive. So if Jesus is God and we're receiving his flesh and his blood, well, this is the flesh and blood of God. I love Ignatius because he's so poetic, he's so warm, he's writing on the fly, and this is real time. I've always wished someone would write a movie about those last days of Ignatius of Antioch because they're so well documented.
That's interesting. That somebody should do a movie. That would be a very interesting movie.
It would.
Absolutely.
You get to change scene a lot and everything.
Well, you mentioned that he did write against Docetism. Some of my
Mhm.
viewers may not know what that is. It comes from a Greek word, dokeo, that means to appear. And so it was a heresy related to Gnosticism, that said Jesus was not really a human being, God in the flesh. He only appeared to be a human being. I guess it's almost like his humanity was simply like a hologram or an avatar, or,
Yes.
but not really and truly a human being. And this points to the fact you already see it in the Gospel of John fighting against it, but the earliest heresy, other than the Judaizing tendencies, was this Gnostic impulse to denigrate the flesh, to denigrate the incarnation. And that led to, the writings even of Saint Irenaeus, the great second century church father who gives witness to apostolic succession and so on.
And Roman primacy. Yes.
And Roman primacy. And so, yeah, already in the second century, you see this grand articulation of the Catholic vision of things because it was being so challenged by Gnostic. You know, I like to say, and you can comment on this, how easy would it have been for the church, and it was a persecuted church off and on in very real ways, how easy would it have been for the church to simply say, yeah, well, you can pretty much to acquiesce to the religious ethos of pagan Rome and say, oh yeah, Jesus is just sort of one image of God among many. We'll place him in the pantheon of deities along with, so we'll recognize that all these other deities are fine, but we're going to worship Jesus or whatever. But they didn't. And here I think the strong element of Judaism, the part that Christianity adopts, comes through, which is no, we are monotheists and we're not going. But how easy would it have been for the church to simply evolve into just one more Roman mystery cult? Let's put it that way.
It would have been very easy because there were many mystery cults, and
Yeah,
and the Romans really didn't have any trouble with them. I mean, they didn't have any problem with that. We don't mind if you're over there worshiping your gods, as long as you're willing to acknowledge our gods too. And you're willing to acknowledge our emperor as kind of a divine person himself. That's all they cared about. They cared about the unity of the empire, and they cared about patriotism, Roman patriotism. They wanted loyalty from their subjects. And what the Christians did was off in its own world in many ways. They would not acknowledge the Roman emperor as anything resembling divine. They would not bow to Roman gods, and it segregated them. Now, they would have had a lot of uh, motivation to just go along to get along, because
yeah.
at that time, since the time of Nero, so 64 AD, since 64 AD, Christianity is a persecuted religion. There are laws on the books against the practice of Christianity, and it's punishable by death. This is a capital crime. If you are caught practicing Christianity, you could be executed in a horrible way the next day,
Yeah.
right? So there would have been a lot of motivation to just keep quiet, go along to get along, ignore those Gnostics, let them do their thing, because you don't want to draw attention to yourself. Every now and then, the pagan Roman officials would get drawn into intra-church disputes, because suddenly a parish church would have a divided congregation, some of whom wanted to go a heretical way, and then they had to deal with the property. So they end up appealing to the courts. And what's very interesting is that when this happened, the Roman officials, wherever they were, they just kicked it upstairs to the Bishop of Rome. And they let the Bishop of Rome decide these property disputes in distant lands. We find that happening as early as the mid-3rd century.
Well, that's very interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's very interesting indeed. I want to come back to this line of thing, but I also don't want to forget to ask you. You mentioned the epistles of Clement of Rome, one of our first popes, and you dated it to 67 A.D. I just heard you say that. Now, that is very interesting to me because I mean, when I was in graduate school, the standard dating for the epistles of Clement was, towards the end of the first century, maybe
Mhm.
even beginning of second century. But then I read a very interesting book. I don't even remember the title or the author about a year ago. Actually, it was a small little book. I read it at a bookstore without buying it. I just sort of quickly read through it, and he was making the case that yeah, Clement of Rome, the epistles were written right around 67 to 70 A.D.
Yes.
And that seems to be the claim that you're making here as well.
Yes. Well, it's been a trend there for a long time. There was a lot invested in the academic mainstream in dating many of the early fathers as late as possible. Okay, so you'll often see that the Didache was written, for example, at the end of the second century when it clearly was not written that late. Okay, and this happens with Clement of Rome too. Now the letter may have been written uh, later in the century than 67 AD, but I tend to favor the early dating. I suspect the book that you're talking about was written by Monsignor Thomas Heron, who got his
Yes.
doctorate in, that's it.
Yeah, that's it. He got it.
He got his doctorate in Rome back in the 80s, and then he was the close associate. He was the secretary to Joseph Ratzinger for many years after that. So he has good credentials and he has a strong background. He died too young, but Monsignor Heron put this forth as a unified argument. But already by then, you have major scholars like Enrico Mazza, Clayton Jefford, uh, accepting the early dating of Clement and the early dating of the Didache. Now, from what I understand, Matthew J. Thomas, who's one of the great living patrologists and still a very young man, is working on a new edition and new translation of Clement of Rome. And from what I've seen of it already, it's going to be a blockbuster. And he brings out a lot of the historical material and he makes a strong case for the early dating of Clement.
That's fantastic because another trend as well among scholars, and all of it is geared towards, in a sense, debunking Catholicism.
Mhm.
Another trend has been to date the Gospels very late,
Yes.
much later. Mark's Gospel, 70 to something. And I mean, I've seen some datings for the Gospel of John as like 95 to 180 and so forth. And yet, I tend to believe in an earlier dating for the Gospels, and for example, I accept the priority of the Gospel of Matthew over the Markan priority thesis, the two source hypothesis Q and all that, that Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark, and then this other source Q, Quelle in German, that has been lost, a series of writings. But I've read very compelling pieces that would argue for Matthean priority. What do you think of that, of those arguments?
I haven't studied the biblical literature very deeply. The New Testament is important to me, obviously, because
Yeah,
because I'm a believing Christian. But so many of those arguments have been irrelevant to me. I really don't care. We're talking about the inspired Word of God here.
right.
Like you, tend to favor the early dates. The evidence points me in that direction, but it's not something that I've studied deeply. It's not something that
Yeah.
I've cared about.
Yeah, me either, actually. And I
Mhm.
only bring it up in the context of this debate about dating everything, later and
Oh,
later,
yes, yes, yes.
and that sort of thing. And I just reject this idea that the apostolic Christianity, in those first 30 or 40 years after the death of Christ, was this loosely organized ragtag group of illiterate people who had no real need for writings or writing things down. It was an oral culture, and stories proliferated and so on. And then eventually later editors and redactors bring things together. We don't really even know who wrote the Gospels and all this kind of thing. And that flies in the face of all the best evidence that the first Christians were very literate and very literary, uh, and that they were writing things down at a very, very early time.
Right.
Uh,
And I mean they wanted to preserve what they had received and preserve it intact. That's what you find through all the fathers. They used words like innovation. We think of these as the hot words in advertising and marketing.
yeah, yeah,
They looked at innovation as the worst insult you could throw at someone, right?
yeah.
That means you're changing things. You're changing what we've received, and we never want to do that. We can develop it, we don't change it. And that's clearly the way of Irenaeus and Basil and Vincent of Lerins and so many others. They insist that we pass on what we've received. We can develop our understanding of it, but we don't change it.
Right, right. I mean, you already see this in St. Paul, late 50s, early 60s. I'm simply preaching to you what I received.
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
And then he
twice.
proceeds to proceeds to give a little creedal statement about
Yes,
the nature of the faith. And well, if he's writing this in the late 50s and he's only telling people what he has received, that means creedal Christianity had already begun, right?
that's
uh,
right.
and rooted in the authority of people like Peter, James, John, and the other apostles. But
and
anyway,
and even we even preserved the apparent discrepancies. We even preserved the apparent inconsistencies. I'm sure there were many temptations to do what Tatian did and just do a harmony of all the gospels
the
so that it
diatessaron, yeah.
yeah, so that it's all there, it's all in a certain order and nothing conflicts with anything else. But no, they wanted to be faithful to what they had received.
Yeah, I often say to people that the subtle chronological sort of contradictions, if you want to put it that way, or difficulties that the Gospels present to us, where they differ seemingly from one another in certain aspects. I always tell people that's actually evidence to me of scriptural integrity and
Yes,
scriptural authority.
yes.
Because if they were simply intent on making something up out of whole cloth, whatever, and making sure that everything was smoothed out, little tiny details too, like the women being the first ones to see the resurrected Christ would have been airbrushed out of the story. All right,
Absolutely.
that would have been airbrushed out of the story. Okay,
Yes.
but they preserved it. Why? Because that's what they were taught, that's what they were told actually
Right.
happened. All right,
Right.
the women were the first witnesses of the resurrection. But anyway, so let's shift gears a bit, if you don't mind,
Mhm.
to a related question, which is, there has been over the past, I don't know, 40, 50 years, this, you see it in authors like a Bart Ehrman or an Elaine Pagels and people like this, and they sort of make a case, a bad one, but they make a case that early Christianity, those before Constantine ruined everything, early Christianity was not unified, that there was no such thing as a single Catholic Church or a single iteration of the true church.
Mhm.
It's better to say that there were Christianities, that
Right.
Christianity was very pluralistic, that nothing had yet coalesced. And therefore, Gnostic Christianity has every bit of a claim to legitimate. This is Elaine Pagels, and the Jesus Seminar, people like John Dominic Crossan. Gnostic Christianity has every bit as much of a claim to being a true version of Christianity. And the only reason why they sort of lost out is they sort of lost the power game, that came later. So what do you make of that argument that there were Christianities and Christianity was just this wildly pluralistic thing?
There's no evidence of that. There are these groups. There are these groups out there who claimed the name of Jesus Christ and believed very different things about the message of Jesus Christ. But they didn't evangelize. They were always parasites upon the church. It seems from all the evidence we have that the Gnostics always went after Christians. They weren't out to convert pagans. They wanted to get at the Christians and bring them over to their knowledge, right? And they did it by flattering them. They did it by telling them, "You are the elite. You are smarter than everybody else. You get it." And they don't. And Christianity has never worked that way, right? The 12 apostles appear in the Gospels to be bozos, right? They're thick skulled. They don't get it, right? To the end, they just appear that way.
Lord, are you
And
going to restore the kingdom now?
right.
And they're still not getting it after the resurrection. No, it has been restored, you fools.
Yes, yes. So I mean, Christianity has never operated on the Gnostic principles, and the Gospels show us a much different religion. Now, Gnosticism and um, its modern promoters, those things have been taken down by the greats, Gary Anderson, uh, N.T. Wright, Paul Mankowski, they wrote definitive
Yeah.
takedowns of Bart Ehrman and Elaine Pagels, and yet those refutations don't make it to press. I think N.T. Wright just did it in a very casual way in his book about the Gospel of Judas, which is one of the big fiascos
Yeah.
of of our time. But N.T. Wright said, you know, that Pagels and others portray this as a great power struggle within the church. There was no power to be had. You could not exercise power over other Christians. Irenaeus was powerless, really, against the Gnostics. Um, because we were persecuted, right? Also, there's
Yeah.
no evidence that the Roman authorities ever went after the Gnostics or martyred Gnostics, but they martyred Catholic Christians. So Irenaeus had that to deal with. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
it, it's a very strange thing that Gnosticism has come back, and especially promoted by some of these people, because Gnostics believed some things that are pretty bad. That
Yeah.
that women are inferior creatures, for example,
Oh, yeah.
and that sex is bad, and all of these other things that we would not want to be enjoying a resurgence.
Yeah, this is one of the great lies, and it's put forward by not just Elaine Pagels, but others. I think one of what it comes through in their writings, one of their motivations for promoting Gnostic Christianity was, well, they weren't as patriarchal. They believed in feminine, aspects to a divine syzygy almost, and
Mm.
the divine feminine and all this sort of stuff. But when you do a deep dumpster dive into the Gnosticism, they were very anti-woman. They were very misogynistic.
Yes, yes, yeah,
Yeah. I
and,
mean,
and
Jesus tells, the apostles, women first have to become men before they can enter the kingdom of heaven in the
yeah.
Gnostic writings.
Right. And all of them point out the same thing. And actually, even Adam Gopnik pointed this out in the pages of the New Yorker. Gopnik's not a believer in anything. He's
Yeah.
not a Christian. He's got a Jewish background, but he's not a believer. And he did a review of the Gospel of Judas at the time it came out, this Gnostic gospel. Uh, uh, and he concluded in the end that it failed because it's bad. It's just bad literature. It's a bad book that went out of print like most books. Most books go out of print in their due time, right? And
Yeah.
it went out of print in the 100s, and it stayed out of print for a long time. Not because Big Bad Irenaeus was suppressing it, but because nobody wanted to read it. Nobody wanted to worship this sneering, snide Messiah, right? Or nobody wanted to be pals with Judas, who's not a savory character even in the gospel that's trying to make him a hero. So it's a very strange phenomenon that we want anything but Christianity. We want anything
Yeah.
but Christ. But
Yeah.
still we want
Yeah.
to have a veneer of Christianity on everything. Flannery O'Connor had her great character Hazel Motes,
Oh,
and
yeah.
he traveled through the countryside preaching the church without Christ, and this scam artist starts following him around and saying, "Hey, I can make money off this," but he can't get the theology of it, so he keeps calling it the Holy Church of Christ without Christ, right?
Yeah.
And that's what people want. They
That
want
is what
all
they
the
want.
good things of Christianity. They want human dignity, human equality. They want war, warfare with morals and that sort of thing. They want all the good things that Christianity brought about, hospitals and universities, you name it. But they don't want Christ because he just makes everything difficult. He just keeps contradicting me.
That's very interesting. And that provides me with a nice segue then from talking about the ancient church to the modern church. And that so many of these controversies are still swirling around. Have you read the book by Tom Holland on
Oh,
yeah, and I recommend it to I haven't read the whole thing. I've read big chunks of it. Uh God, I can't, what's the title of it? I can't even think of it.
Dominion.
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 Yeah.
Yeah.
Dominion.
It
Thank you.
was
It
a
was
New
a bit.
York Times bestseller, and I love the book, and I did finish it, and I reviewed it for Angelus News.
Oh,
But
very good. I got to go
so
read that. So
it,
I'm going to talk about his thesis because it's very pertinent to what you
yes,
just said about the
yes,
Church of Christ without Christ and
yes,
what we owe Christianity. So
that's
talk
right.
about that. Go ahead.
So he has written an intellectual history of the West. That's
Right.
what that book is, and he's done it in order to prove something. Now you have to understand Holland is is an agnostic,
Right.
uh, and he's got a weak Protestant background, right? But his thesis is this: everything you love about this civilization, everything you want to hold on to, is there only because Christianity put it there, right?
Right. Right.
And the second part of it is Christianity has been on the wane for 300 years now, right? Thereabouts, okay? And it's been waning. And as it fades in influence, all of those things start to fade as well, and we're losing our hold of them. So he's troubled, he's vexed by this. He goes so far as to say that the only two honest souls of these last centuries are the Marquis de Sade and Friedrich Nietzsche, because they saw the consequences of an
Yeah.
abandonment of Christianity and they embraced it, right? They saw it, and they recognized it, and they said, yes, let's go forward. And they wanted other people to acknowledge it too, but other people not so much. But again, they bring up all of these things that we love: human equality. That, this isn't something that really existed as an idea before Christianity. uh, uh, Human dignity, we don't have that without the book of Genesis. And
Yeah.
all of these great things in our civilization, these monuments in our civilization, which are ideas but also institutions, as I said, like the university and the hospital. We lose a lot the more we lose Christianity.
Yeah. And, I can't recommend to my listeners more highly, yeah, Tom
Yes.
Holland's book Dominion. Thank you for reminding me of the title. It's been about 6 months since I've read about 2/3 of it. Now I need to go back and finish it after this conversation with you. Uh,
There are two books that really got me going in writing in this field, because I wanted to emphasize this difference between between pre-Christianity and post-Christianity. Uh, and One was The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark back in the 1990s, because here was another agnostic who was horrified by what he was seeing in contemporary culture. And he saw that as we lose Christianity, we're losing everything we love. So Stark first raised the alarm. Holland, just wrote, this
yeah,
is this is 25 years later, and Holland wrote a book that was just magisterial and huge and irrefutable, I'd say, in its conclusions.
I think it is irrefutable. E- it- I saw just a few months ago the fire breathing dragon atheist Richard Dawkins,
Yes.
that wrote, the Atheist Delusions. Wasn't that the name? No, that was David Hart who wrote Atheist Delusions.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't remember the name of Richard Dawkins' book.
It's
Uh,
something
uh,
like the God Delusion or
the
something.
God
It is
Delusion.
strong. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, it had delusion in it. Anyway, it's been years since I read it, but he came out as a response to, uh, the craziness of transgenderism and woke culture and all this. And he gave an interview, and he said, "Look, I would much rather live in a society that has Christian values in it, a
Mhm.
Christian civilization, than in this civilization that is now emerging." Did you happen to see that?
I did. I did. I was heartened by that. There's hope for him. And there's hope for Tom Holland too. He has confessed in a recent interview that he got some tests coming back positive from cancer.
Right.
And so he prayed, get this, and he describes himself as a very Protestant agnostic, but he prayed to the Blessed Virgin Mary.
And he was cured.
And the next tests came back negative. So he's not calling it a miracle.
No, but
But
I read that article. It was bookmarked on my webpage. I thought I'm going to save this. Tom Holland
Yeah.
saying that through the intercession of the Virgin Mary or whatever, you know, it might be post hoc ergo propter. You know, it's
Yeah.
like after the fact, therefore because of it. But thinking, and he says, okay, fine, yeah, you know, it happened after I prayed, so maybe. So there you go.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are these little. All is not hopeless. And you said,
No.
yeah, you know, Tom Holland and others point out, you know, the Christianity is waning, but I would qualify that by saying it's waning in the global north, right?
Yeah.
It's waning in North America. It's waning in Europe, but it's not really waning in Africa or Asia, where
Yeah.
it is still. Go ahead.
Yeah, and not only that, and I should qualify that because I'm actually a fairly optimistic person. You know, having lived through the 60s and the 70s, you know, I much prefer the times we're living in now, where I can get essays by Larry Chapp, you know, by hitting a button. I can watch your podcast. I can watch any number of other podcasts of faithful Catholics. I don't know what your experience was, Larry, but in the 60s and 70s, I kind of experienced Catholicism as a cultural wasteland. There wasn't a
No.
lot going on in publishing,
Right.
especially the kind of publishing I do, right? You know,
Yeah.
there weren't a lot of Catholic publishers putting out a lot of exciting books. Right now, the books are coming out so fast and so thick that I could never ever keep up with it, even if I retired, and I have no intention of retiring. But it's a much it's a different time now qualitatively, and there are exciting cultural things happening. You know, you're connected in a Catholic world that's
Yeah.
vibrant, it's exciting. You see a new ballet coming up, you know, right
Yeah.
now. That's an exciting event, and Catholics in general across the country are aware of it,
Yeah.
that there is this happening. So I am positive. I am optimistic. All of these things come at a cost, of course. You know, we faithful Catholics. I hope I'm being faithful all the time, but we're exposed, and people are going to come after us. But you know
Yeah.
that's going to happen. But
I'm
I'm loving.
optimistic too. I mean, I like you. I'm think I'm older than you. I'm 65. And you know, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and the Catholic, and I'm a cradle Catholic, and the Catholicism I grew up with and the great American, you know, heartland, Lincoln, Nebraska, was still, I mean, Lincoln was not exactly a hotbed of wild progressive Christianity at all, but quite the opposite. And yet, still, the Catholicism that was presented to me in my youth was still that beige Catholicism, that felt banner Catholicism, that St. Louis Jesuits and guitar mask Catholicism. And it just didn't provoke, it didn't grab me at all. And I do think that finally, and people disagree with me. Finally, we are seeing the fruits of the Second Vatican Council in one great sense, and the council takes it on the nose from hard traditionalism. It's the cause of all the, and yet look at something this simple: the explosion of lay people doing things like we're doing right now, that you do, that I do, the explosion of lay theologians, the explosion of traditionalist theologians or personalities with their YouTube stuff. That would have been unheard of before the council. The
Right.
council created this explosion of lay theologians, lay people, leaders, and this that the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, Scott Hahn, you know, these there is just this vast array. I'm with you. I can't keep up with it all
Yeah.
anymore. And all these young scholars, you know, that are out there, Jacob Wood and others. I mean, the new polity guys in your neck of the
Yeah.
woods. Oh my
Yes. Yes.
goodness.
Yeah. It is exciting, and there's a lot of ferment right now. Um, when I was a child, the the thought of a lay person leading a parish mission, for example,
Yeah.
that was unthinkable. That never would have happened. It never would have happened. Now I'd say that most parish missions are run by lay people, most of them, because we don't have enough priests
Right.
to to deal with the basic parish life that we need, right? So
Yeah.
I do think that even the priest shortage is something that God has permitted for the good of the entire church,
Yeah.
to make the
Yeah.
rest of us get out of this clericalist slumber that we've been in since 380 AD.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, and also the rise of so many brilliant female theologians
Hmm.
in the Catholic Church. I can think of very few theologians working right now as brilliant as, say, Jennifer Martin at Notre Dame, who I absolutely adore her writings. I think of someone like Tracy Rowland in Australia, who I just interviewed, won the Ratzinger Prize. I mean, these kinds of female theologians just, I mean, before the council, I mean, come on, that just would have been unheard of.
Yeah.
And yet their contributions to the church right now are just immense.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm excited, I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, I'm all of those things. I love the moment we're living in. And there's no,
Yeah.
as much as I love the fathers, and as much as I ignore so much of modern history because I love the fathers so much, I wouldn't live in any other moment.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. But what do you see as some of the negatives going on in the modern church? I don't want to end on a negative. We still have a little bit of time here left. I mean, I see some negatives out there still, the resurgence of a certain kind of progressive Catholic theology going on in the church. Do you see any sort of worrying dark clouds?
That's it. I mean, what you just said there, and I'll tell you, it reminds me of it's kind of a resurgence of that
Yeah,
weak tea that I got in religion class when I was a kid. It's very interesting because until I was in fifth grade, we had to memorize the Baltimore Catechism, and we had a big thick edition of it that we had to have totally committed to memory before we could be confirmed, right? So I did it, right? Um, and uh, and it's very interesting. When we came back to school for sixth grade, somebody had flipped a switch. Somebody had flipped a switch, and now it's like we regressed. We'd done all that serious theology that goes on in the Baltimore Catechism. It gives you a metaphysical grounding. What is man? Man is a creature composed of body and soul, made to the image and likeness of God. You have that as part of your inner construction, you've got a lot. You can do morals, you can do ethics, you can do politics. So we came out fifth grade and we're doing coloring, we're doing worksheets, and we're doing all this stuff, and it kind of stayed that way, with the felt banners and burlap and all that stuff, until I finished school. What we were presented as Catholicism seemed stupid to us, with two O's,
yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
and and so many of us abandoned the faith. Uh, I'm not thrilled about that style of Catholicism coming back, because it wasn't effective the first time around. It just kind of fizzled out when we were presented with the vigorous orthodoxy of John Paul II. We all went, whoa, and here's something I can get behind, and here's something I can believe in. And I think that uh,
Yeah.
it's when people respond to Catholicism now, they're not responding to this latest wave of mushiness. They're responding still to the witness of John Paul II. I believe that we're still experiencing the effects of that wave.
We are. And I mean, I try to the best that I can when I'm dialoguing with, or in person or in writing, with much younger Catholics. I try to give them a sense of just how important Pope John Paul II was,
Mhm.
just how earth shakingly important he was when he ascended the papacy in 1978, because of what had gone on in the church for the 13 previous years.
Yeah.
This kind of immense decomposition of the church into this pablum, into this anodyne nothingness. And onto the scene emerges this young, vibrant Polish man who was so inspiring. And for a lot of younger Catholics, even if they were alive, during the end of John Paul's pontificate, all they remember is the frail John Paul, the ill John Paul. and then they're fed talking points on the internet about, well, what about that event at Assisi or whatever, and there's this new movement on both the right, the hard right, and the far left, if those categories mean anything, to sort of denigrate John Paul II. And yet I'm saying, I just want to scream at the walls in my room and say, no, no, this is the greatest pope perhaps in the history of the church, one of the top 5 greatest popes in the history of the church.
I agree with you. I agree with you. When you had to, after that desert that I knew the 70s to be, right?
Yeah,
After that desert, suddenly to be confronted with things like World Youth Day in Denver. Whoa, that I think changed life in Catholic parishes in this country. It had a
did.
seismic effect on Catholic life in parishes in this country. So you have events like that. You have the emergence of EWTN, right? And other
Ignatius
mass
Press.
Ignatius Press, these mass phenomena that really were giving us the goods.
Yeah.
I consider Scott Hahn to be one of those phenomena himself.
Oh,
Just by
absolutely.
himself, he was doing something that seemed revolutionary at the time, that seemed impossible, and he just did it. He just did it.
Yeah, yeah. Scott Hahn is yeah, one of the most important figures in that sort of rejuvenation of the church, I think. And I don't think Joe Fessio gets enough credit either
Well, he
for.
hasn't sought it.
Yeah, no, he hasn't, because he's a very
Mhm.
humble man. You and I both know him. What a
Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful guy he is. But just how, how different would the American Catholic Church, the English speaking church, look without Ignatius Press stepping in and translating De Lubac, Balthasar, Ratzinger, Daniel Lou, Louis Bouillet, Guardini, and putting it out there for us. I mean, when I was a young man, I feasted. I gosh, I remember I was a seminarian, what little money that I would have, because I was what it was gobbled up by Ignatius Press.
But you'd look at what they were doing and you'd say, these people must be crazy. There are probably 7 of us in the United States buying these books, but it was like a squirrel's horde. It was very squirrely, It was like
Yeah.
this horde, that they were building up and building up and building up, and they were really fortifying the next generation of intelligent Catholics.
And it was on a wing and a prayer. I mean, I met the great Father Simeon, who was a Trappist monk up in Massachusetts, in Spencer, but his original name was Erasmo Levi Marikakis, and he was the first translator of the very first book that Ignatius Press published by von Balthasar, called Heart of the World. Heart of the World. And it just happened because, he had this conversation with Balthasar. Just he had written to Balthasar and Balthasar had written him back. And so then Fessio is talking to Balthasar about, okay, we want to translate some of your stuff. And Balthasar goes, oh, well, I've been corresponding with this dude in Georgia. All right. Maybe he could translate some of this stuff. And so Fessio calls, Erasmo, and the rest is history. And boom, out comes this book. And I remember talking to Joe Fessio about it. And he says, yeah, it was just by the seat of our pants, on a wing and a prayer. How do you not see the movement of the Holy Spirit in that?
I think that all the time, and I get excited. I do hope that someone writes a good history of our time, the time that you and I were growing up and everything,
Yeah.
because I think it's elusive. I try to talk to younger people about it and what it was like, and they can't seem to get it, just how bad it was, and
Yeah.
maybe I am just turning into an old man who said I had to walk to school and, in the
Oh
snow
yeah,
two
yeah. We
miles.
yeah we had to lick the road clean with our tongues in the morning for breakfast. That kind of talk. Yeah, you guys have it. So no, no, it's not. I try to communicate to people. Just when you think it can't possibly been as bad as the caricature is, it was. I remember I had a conversation with, and I'm not name dropping. I've known with Robert Barron. I've known Robert Barron for many, many years. I'm sure you have too. But I had a conversation with him one time on this very topic. And he said, yeah, Larry, I remember when I was a young man, the priest drove up the aisle of the church in a motorcycle. You know, that was the entrance of the priest to that day's mass, was because he wanted to be, I don't know, modern, relevant, theatrical. entertaining, whatever it was. And,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, into that maelstrom of stupidity, what George Weigel calls the silly season.
Yeah.
Uh, and I said to George once, it was beyond silly. Actually, there was something very nefarious about it, and he agreed. But yeah, into that marched John Paul, and then, not to be downplayed, Pope Benedict. Following up on John Paul, those two giants of the faith, stabilizing the church, and what I see now as an effort, not by Pope Francis, but an effort by those who view him as their ally to sort of undermine that legacy of
Mhm.
John Paul and Benedict. And that deeply troubles me.
Yeah, it troubles me too. I don't know if it deeply troubles me. It doesn't keep me awake at night. I mean, I think that God's got this, and I've seen so many signs of encouragement. I've seen so many signs of great things happening, and I've experienced them myself. In my own life, my own career, I've just felt like God's had me all the way through it,
Yeah,
and God has his church,
he really does. God really does have his church, and the See of Peter, regardless of current controversies, is still
mhm,
the rock of Peter.
it is.
I sense lately from Pope Francis, for example, and I've been critical of Francis because I saw him as energizing this wing of the church. But I think he wanted to energize a more pastoral church or something, whatever you want to call it, an accompaniment church, a church of the peripheries. And I think he's looking out now, and he's saying, wait a minute, folks, no, we're not going to have women deacons, we're not going to have women priests, we're not going to have married priests, we're not going to have a change in the church's teaching on contraception. All right. We're not going to have gay marriage in the church and so on. So lately, he's issued a series of no's, no,
Yeah.
no.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I see that as him looking out and saying, no, no, the church of Jesus Christ cannot allow these things to happen.
Yeah. He did a great interview shortly before he became pope, in which he talked about the fathers of the church. And he said that this is the patrimony we have received. And if you do anything that veers from that, if you do anything that sets you
Yeah.
apart from that, well, we call that heresy. And he said that
Yeah.
that very clearly. And I think he's always had that in mind. He did come from that generation when there was a lot of ferment around the council, and I think a lot of people in that generation have a certain loyalty to their teachers, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is admirable, that they still feel a certain loyalty to their teachers from that time, whom they loved, and they're trying to take it forward. But I think that
Yeah.
reality kind of shows you why those teachers
Yeah.
didn't enjoy success the first time, and why they won't the second time.
Yeah. Well, I'm not as big a fan of Pope Francis as I am of John Paul and Benedict, but he is the Pope and he deserves our
Yes,
respect.
yes.
And people think I'm a disliker of Pope Francis, and that's not at all true.
Mhm.
He's a very interesting figure in his own right. But anyway, enough ecclesia. Before we've got maybe 5 minutes left here or whatever, I want to return to the church fathers because that's why I brought you on here. All
Uh-huh.
right.
Yeah.
What if to those listening and viewing, if you could recommend to any, which church fathers do you think would be most beneficial for an average Catholic to sort of pick up and read?
Well, I always tell people to start at the beginning. Start with the earliest fathers and see how Catholic they were from the very beginning. The great concern of Christians in that first generation was liturgy. It's
Yeah,
about doing liturgy right. That's what Clement of Rome was writing to the Corinthians about, and that's what Ignatius was concerned about as well. There were other things too, and all of the other things are very important. But start with Clement. Start with Ignatius. Look at the Didache too. So get yourself a good edition of the Church Fathers. My
yeah.
favorite translations are Ken Howell's, and they're
Okay.
Kenneth Howell's, and they're good translations with good introductory material too, and good notes. They'll carry you through. But if you can't get your hands on that, Baker Books has a nice hardcover one that's pretty. and that's a good addition too. And Penguin Books has one too by that's edited by Andrew Louth, who's a great scholar, and it'll serve you well. That's probably the cheapest of all the editions. But they're out there. They're easy for you to get to. I say always start with the earliest and move forward from there, because that's when you get excited. You go from those apostolic fathers, you say, give me more, and then you get to Justin and Irenaeus in the next generation, and your mind goes boom.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Clement of Alexandria
Oh yeah, and
and
Tertullian, you're having fun
Tertullian.
with Tertullian. He's
Gre
it's like
Gre
having Don Rickles in your living room.
I love Gregory of Nyssa.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, I love Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom, Basil of Caesarea, even Eusebius had
Yes.
some wonderful writings. And of course, the great Saint Augustine, to go and read the City of God, his confessions, his homilies. Augustine has so much to offer us as well. There's just what I want Catholics to understand, especially younger Catholics, is that the church has no deficit of intellectual life going back to her origins.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I
Yeah.
remember, and we should not be afraid. I remember as a young seminarian, I was at the Civic Center in Philadelphia when John Paul visited, and he repeated in his address to the seminarians there his famous phrase, "Be not afraid, be not afraid, launch into the deep waters." And this is, and I think he says that because he understands we have nothing to be afraid of. Christ, not just that Christ is on our side and the gospel is true, but we have a vast history of rich writings from the doctors of the church and the fathers of the church to draw upon.
That's true. And we've barely scratched the surface of it in terms of retelling of the story and in terms of scholarship upon the works of those earliest Christians.
And that's why I was so excited to have you on here today, Mike, because I never said this to you when we met in person, but I truly believe that what you have done in terms of not just popularizing, that maybe comes across as a little bit condescending, but
No, I take that as a compliment.
okay,
That
good.
I want to
Popularizing
reach people.
the church fathers, I think it's one of the most important things that has happened in the past 30 years of the church are your writings on the church father. I know so many people who I told I'm interviewing Mac Aquilina. It's, oh, I read his the book. I read that book, and what you have done, Mike, is just your first off, your output is right up there with Matthew Levering, for crying out loud. It's like Matt writes a new book every 3 days, it seems, and you have cranked out so much stuff just so your sheer energy and the evident joy that you bring to what you do, I think is so unbelievably important. And the work you've done with Scott Hahn. So thank you so much for everything you've done.
Well, you're very kind. You're very kind. It's all been a gift. I've loved doing what I'm doing. I feel like I shouldn't get too much credit because it's been fun and I've been able to get paid for having fun for 30 years.
That's great. That's great. Well, and thank you for being, we had to cancel this once. And so thank you for rescheduling and agreeing to come on here today. Any
I
last
consider this
words?
an honor. I consider this an honor, and I thank you for having me on it. Those would be my last words. Thanks for being the inspiration you are, Larry. We'll keep this going as long as we're going.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye now.